Here.
Why am I like this?
I don't know.
Okay.
Anyway, okay. Welcome.
Wait, I'm starting welcome.
Okay. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, all right, here we go. Welcome to In Front of Ira. Sabrina, what is the problem here?
I don't know.
What is the problem here? We should not be allowed recording technology. It does not suit our professionalism at all.
I feel like you should just start it like this because everyone knows the intro. Like, somebody is gonna drop into.
Basically, our creative versions of the intro are going to be our calling card.
Exactly. It's like, welcome to In Front of Ira. Me breaks. Okay, let's move on.
Let's start this again. Okay. So here I am starting this again. Welcome to In Front of Ira.
We're Sabrina.
And Torsten.
Two historians.
And friends.
And lovers.
Of romantic comedies.
And this is the podcast in which we answer the age-old question.
Will they or won't they?
Is it or isn't it a romantic comedy?
Technically, that's two questions.
I am still doing this video, not just me.
We need something new here. We need something new here. It never works. We need something new here.
We're gonna do something like the new thing is I will read some of the notes that are in the same Google Doc that describe the podcast. So if you're new to this podcast, according to the notes, it is a podcast centered on discussing rom-coms as a genre by themselves in context, I guess. And then there's some structure we never quite follow that includes things like
standard intro,
plotline, the fake taglines, the actual tagline, a wild tangent, and then discuss the movie. And I feel like 80% is the wild tangent.
I think we're pretty good at wild tangent.
Yeah, anyway, this is Wild Tangent, the podcast.
Wild Tangent, the podcast, also sounds like a David Lynch movie. So make of that what you will.
I listened to Kyle MacLachlan on Brett Goldstein's podcast. It was very fun.
He is remarkable.
That. Yeah. Anyway, so Pretty Woman is what we're discussing.
Yes, today. This is a very unknown movie that probably
nobody has seen.
Nobody has seen it. It's known only for one thing, and that's the fact that it jump-started Jason Alexander's career. That is the one thing it did. Okay, no, obviously.
Right, wait, that must be, it's pre-Seinfeld, right?
No, it is like this is why he got Seinfeld, because people were like, you played a really, really horrible person in this movie. This is gonna fit another fine.
Also, while we're on the subject matter, Jerry Seinfeld is a tool, and the only cool people on Seinfeld are actually Jason Alexander and Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and we need to cancel him.
We do not need to cancel Jason Alexander. Okay, please. Let's be clear
Seinfeld,
here.
Like, we need to cancel Seinfeld because it was never that funny. It's always been just the other people.
These are you're gonna make some enemies there right away.
Yeah.
Okay. So Jason Alexander, one of the standouts of the Seinfeld cast, carries this movie, also starring Julia Roberts and
Richard Gere. I mean, it does. Obviously, the person's whose career it really, really jumpstarts is Julia Roberts. Even though we should like. It feels like it is what really makes her the star she is, although she was already Oscar nominated before she was in Pretty Woman, because she's Oscar nominated for supporting actress in Steel Magnolias and had also done Mystic Pizza. And Mystic Pizza is, I think, that is really her debut, and that's sort of like not everyone sees that as it comes out. It feels like a lot of people will come back to it as well because she's a bit later.
I certainly came back to it.
Yeah, she actually, like, Steel Magnolias is kind of really the thing, I think. And then
I don't actually remember that one at all.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to watch that and I had a really hard time with it, but like it was obviously a big deal at the time.
Okay, well, Julia Roberts, known for Magnolias and pizza, now lands on Hollywood Boulevard.
Yep.
Do we need to? I think we need to discuss. First of all, I think how this movie kind of came about, because it is such a weird movie. I rewatched this last night, so and maybe like a little bit of background. I asked Carrie, my girlfriend, yesterday if we could watch this together, because I need to do it for the podcast, and she's like, "Oh yeah, maybe we should watch it tonight and then just watch Pretty Woman." And then I basically was like, "Oh no, I kind of don't want to do that. Let's watch, like Doctor Who or like the Franklin miniseries on Apple." And then after that, I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna watch like the first couple of minutes or like half hour, and then I'll have less time that I need to be watching it tomorrow for the podcast. And so I put it on at like, I think almost midnight, and she usually goes to bed really early, like before 11ish often. And she basically like brushes her teeth, like sees me start Pretty Woman, and like just sits down. And like before we know it, we've watched the whole thing all the way through.
I hate to break it to you, Pretty Woman is a really good movie.
And this is the takeaway. I've seen it so many times, but yesterday is when I realized just how good this movie is. And it's really one of those movies that is so much more than the sum of its parts, because it really shouldn't work, but it works so well.
It works so well. So like, I feel like it's so easy to go into this now, and actually Googling it, I found the absolutely expected Vogue article of, "I'm 24 and I watched Pretty Woman for the first time. Let me tell you, some of it is problematic." And I'm like, why is this a genre now of like Gen Z watches things that came out before they were born? I'm like, I mean, like, yeah.
It feels a little bit. Yeah, it feels a little bit like, I watched 1950s minstrelsy, and let me tell you, it's problematic.
It was racist. Yeah.
Like, I think your levels are still a little bit high. I think this is always what happens.
I'm turning them down. Anyway, so yeah, it is directed by Gary Marshall, who obviously is like one of the big sort of rom-com people because of this one as well. I think the weird thing with the screenplay is that it's by a guy called J.F. Lawton, and he hasn't done all that much.
Yeah, there's a whole thing in what's his name? I read this book a while ago, and now I just read the part of Pretty Woman again. Brian,
he made some weird film called something with cannibalistic avocados. I don't.
So his story is, and this is from the book that I read, and I now can't. Like, I'm such an idiot. It's this book on basically romantic comedies, and I think you also have it. Like, I think I've seen it on your shelf. It's Brian something. What is this?
Yeah.
And like I think he was like an editor for Canon Films, like the like B movie horror studio, and tried to write the most commercial stuff he could, but it never sold. And then he at some point went in the other direction and went like, I'm going to make like an arty movie about a sex worker who is paid $3,000 by this horrible tycoon, kind of like inspired by Wall Street. And it's going to be like a dark indie movie. And that turned out to be Pretty Woman.
Yeah, and then Gary Marshall was like, no, let me turn that into one of the biggest rom-coms, modern fairy tale stories, which very Gary Marshall, I guess. So yeah, there is a like a lot of people have said there's like a significantly darker version of this screenplay probably, and the story is which makes sense. But yeah, like, I mean, for somehow people who have lived under a rock, obviously the plot is that Julia Roberts' character is this sex worker who's only like, she's not done sex work for a very long time, like, which is also like kind of, I think, a core part of this. It's sort of the cliche storyline of she's like from the South, she's small town girl who always dated the wrong guys, followed some asshole to LA and then stranded there without money and sort of didn't want to return back to her family. but couldn't make rent based on on other jobs. Like she said, she was a fast food, like she worked for McDonald's or something, that kind of thing, and then couldn't make the rent, and then met Kit, this friend she lives with, who's a sex worker, and who's got her into this, and they were like very about like, we're doing this on our own terms and we're not getting a pimp and whatever. And so she's been doing this for a bit, but not for too long. And that is her. And then Richard Gere is this like incredibly rich guy whose father just died and sort of left him all the money, and he's works in finance, and is this like guy who buys up companies who are basically struggling, and is like, you know, and it feels like he's sort of stuck in his life because that's what he grew up in. Not that
with a very bad like dad who did not appreciate him. That's a whole part of the storyline.
And like, I mean, he said like his dad just died a month ago, but he hadn't talked to him in 14 years. And then Jason Alexander is this asshole lawyer, and he's in town for business, and he's also just breaking up with someone, and he's driving in his lawyer's car that he can't drive because it's a stick shift.
Because his own limousine is like parked in at some party where we start this movie.
And then he drives down and then actually asks for directions, not sex, and this is when Julia Roberts gets in his car. And ends up driving the car because she can actually drive stick. Which I think is actually a metaphor, not the kind of metaphor you think, but mostly because there's several cases of where we get the idea that he's sort of this guy who grew up so rich that he's sort of out of touch with a certain number of things. Like he can't drive stick, he keeps saying he misses keys when he can't get into the door with like the key card.
Which like I remember this line distinctly, and I remember it from a West Wing episode where Bradley Whitford says it, and like it only hit me as I rewatched Pretty Woman this time. Oh, somebody's making a reference. Like I completely went by me.
And so sort of that kind of vibe, and obviously it is the kind of story where she's sort of young and naive to a certain point, or used to be, and he is already very jaded by everything, or is sort of grown up jaded, I guess. And then the commonality, as they also directly spell out, is that they both screw people for money.
Which is nicely put. I mean, many thoughts on how those things are the same but not the same, but
and I mean, obviously, like, we're supposed to now find this all incredibly problematic because it's not a realistic portrayal of sex work per se. Like, it is sort of, or it's sort of the idea of sex work of like, oh, she fell into it and she's actually better than this, but there are other people who are like different and kind of thing. But again, it's sort of like it is certain tropes that work for a reason, but I think it just works because of the two of them, like, as always.
Yeah, it truly is one of those movies. The only other one I can think of, which is not really comparable, that is one of those movies that really shouldn't work and only really works because of the characters and the casting, is that Jennifer Lawrence movie where she's hired as basically an escort for this couple's son, and I don't remember what it was called. It was relatively prominent like last year or so, and then showed up on Netflix, and it's one of those movies where you think this really is such a weird premise that it can't actually work, and it you can see where it lags, or where it kind of like doesn't really quite connect, but the actors just take it and they just like push it through to the finish line with such confidence that you just sit there. I'm like, yeah, no, okay, I buy it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it is immediately, like, I mean, the ending also makes very clear that it is sort of this modern fairy tale that, like, you know, probably wouldn't happen, sort of urban myth, urban legend kind of fairy tale. And I mean, in so many ways, a lot of rom-coms are. So, like, if you're, like, in for the ride. Also, like, I mean, we're not really, like, at the point where we do reviews, but, like, as always, Roger Ebert's review was exactly that. It's like, this shouldn't work, but it actually works. And the fairy tale ending is a bit tacked on, but you also kind of want it. And yeah.
And it is actually like, it feels tacked on. On the other hand, now I have seen this, and I will admit, I haven't seen it quite as many times as When Harry Met Sally, but I did at some point own the original DVD when it first came out, which was one of those DVDs you had to flip over in at the like half of the movie, which is I think why at some point this is a DVD that I finally got rid of because like I just couldn't deal with that. But I've seen it quite a lot of times, and it's the fairy tale ending may seem like it was tacked on, but it is very clearly set up throughout the movie. And it's very clearly signposted when she talks about her dream being that somebody would rescue her and climb up to her tower.
And all of that. And also, and obviously like a significant, he's afraid of heights, which also is a metaphor, but also is like he will climb up the fire ladder in the end and get her. But also like Kit, when she has that conversation, is like, oh, who has this actually happened to? And she's like, well, Cinderella, like, you know.
Which is like the one like made up word from this movie that I think everybody remembers. And it's set, and the reason I say that it's pretty much set up in the beginning is the first scene that we see of Vivian is her kind of getting ready in this apartment that she shares with Kit, and then going down the fire escape, right? Yeah. So like, you know that this is where she is, and it finds her there again. So for something that supposedly is tagged on, it really, or tacked on, it really works. It's structurally,
and I mean,
structurally really works.
I think it is at the point where Gary Marshall takes the script and is like, we're going to turn this into this kind of fairy tale story. So like it is tagged on in the sense that probably the original story by the like screenwriter was not that, because that's the idea we get. But then he was like, no, we're going to turn it into this. But if I want to end up there, I need to like lay the path there. And this is clearly still thought out as the script that it was filmed as.
And there's a lot, and I finally found the book. It's Scott Meslow's From Hollywood with Love, and it's a chapter in that. And he kind of talks about how this screenplay was written by J.F. Lawton, who at some point wrote this screenplay as basically kind of like a dark indie movie, I suppose, called 3000 for the $3,000 that she gets from Edward. And then it's workshopped at Sundance, and a lot of prominent people like see it and comment on it, and people kind of understand that it's a hot commodity, but nobody really buys it because it's a weird storyline about a sex worker and a really unlikable business tyrant, kind of like Wall Street type. And nobody understands how this could possibly work until, like, of all studios, Disney ends up buying it and putting Gary Marshall on it. And then there's rewrites by J.F. Lawton, and then there's uncredited rewrites by, I think it's Brian Metcalf, definitely a man named Metcalf, who essentially isn't credited because he doesn't
be a script doctor.
No, he actually, when this goes into arbitration, is working on too many other projects and kind of basically just doesn't have time to put in the effort to fight for his role in this. And he brings in elements like the idea of this being Pygmalion, which clearly is in this movie.
Yeah. And, I was gonna say that, like, I think what the other thing it is, other than the like sort of the fairy tale structure, is clearly like the comedy of manners, like the way the U.S. society can do comedy of manners, because obviously as class exists in the U.S., but like in a different way than it would be in the U.K. where this comes from. So like in the U.S. you can do it with things like, well, she's from the South, she's a sex worker, she comes from poverty. She's not, like, it is that sort of like not cultured in the sense of she just didn't have access to it. Like, I think the film does a good job of not saying, oh, she's a country bumpkin and she's just too stupid for opera or something. No, it's like she just didn't have access to anything. Like, how would she have had it? And sort of that scene where he takes her to the opera is very much framed as that way. It's like, some people love the opera, some don't, like some come to appreciate it, but like you just need to expose people to it. And then he reads things to her and, you know, all that kind of thing.
At some point, this is the thing that I noticed, like when they have like there's a point in where she convinces him to take a day off and they kind of just goof off and lie in the park, and he reads to her.
It's Shakespeare,
It's not just Shakespeare. It's a book of Shakespeare quotations. That's what it says in it.
Yeah.
I'm like, Who has a book of Shakespeare quotations just know. Like idly to read? It's so weird. It's such a weird choice.
Maybe it was left in the hotel suite, and that's what they had.
It's like the Bible. Instead of the Bible, they're like putting Shakespeare quotations in.
But also like she watches, like she literally makes use of the TV in the hotel room whenever he's
watches I Love Lucy.
Whatever, watches I Love Lucy, and she watches Charade, which I think is significant actually. And and that kind of stuff, and then obviously the other sort of comedy of manners Pygmalion kind of thing is when he takes her to the fancy dinner with his client, or like not really client, like the person who's like the father-son duo whose company he is apparently like basically poaching, and then
his corporate rating,
and then Hector Elizondo, who's in every Garry Marshall movie always, is the guy who is sort of the concierge of the hotel who helps.
Yeah, he's been called in the MacLeod book. He's referred to as the fairy godmother, which is fair.
Yeah,
getting her the clothing.
He's in Princess Diaries as well. He's the bodyguard of the grandmother, but he's sort of a similar role. And he, like, again, Elizondo's in every Garry Marshall movie. The other guy who's actually in every Garry Marshall movie, whose name I don't even know, is the guy who's the bellman, like the sort of the elevator bellhop guy.
Oh yeah, hold on. I'm researching this as we speak, because
he pops up in things. Like, I recognize his face, but like mostly from Garry Marshall movies. He also sort of has a very short moment, because I recently watched the Princess Diaries, that's why I noticed. But like, again, there was one Valentine's Day that we discussed in there, yeah, again, it's sort of the comedy of manners thing, but obviously the dynamic is that he gives her access to these things because he has the money, but she is the one who sort of like reminds him that there are other things to life that are not money, and that usual dynamic. And I think what I loved about Roger Ebert's review, there's a sentence in it where he says, they fall into a particularly romantic kind of love, the sort you hardly see in the movies these days. Mind you, this is 1990. A love based on staying awake after the lights are out and confiding autobiographical secrets. And I think that is actually also kind of key why this movie works, is that kind of intimacy that is not actually about them having sex, that is about them staying awake at night and sort of talking about their lives. And
yeah, there is all of the set pieces. I mean, like, can you call them set pieces? I mean, they're set pieces in the sense that they are sets elsewhere, are work in this, and the famous opera scene, and when they go to the polo and all of that. But most of this movie is in that hotel suite and them just talking. And this is, again, the thing that I think really works for romantic comedies where it doesn't work for other kinds of movies. They are movies in which talking is important, and in which talking is really at the center of it. So they're not often the most visually interesting movies, but they often are movies that really kind of grip you if the dialogue is well done. And Pretty Woman, it has dialogue that is, it's not realistic in the sense that you would actually talk to people like that, but it feels like it's just enough on the side of pseudo-realistic that it doesn't feel acted or overacted like so many other things do in movies of that era and also today. So that is one of the other reasons that I think this movie works, is the way that they let these actors speak and talk to each other and interpret the script that's in front of them. And
I think, I mean, in terms of like, yeah, it's not cinematography, like there isn't any like cool necessary shots. So as you said, like the locations, and I mean, I think LA as a location is super important because it is that sort of Hollywood fairy tale kind of spirit of like,
which is referenced, right? That's the framing device. Yeah.
It's a framing device, but also, and it works very well with the different settings and the like kind of highs and lows of LA that are right next to each other. But at the same time, I think the visually stunning things in the movie are mostly Julia Roberts in various, like the fashion, the costume design of the movie are some of the things that you remember. Not even in the sense of like, she's not even necessarily being sexualized in that way, although I do want to talk about sort of like the thing that there are like people still get to have sex in movies in 1990, but it sort of obviously her in the bathtub, that sort of famous scene with the headphones and like listening to Prince, that shot, and then her in that like red dress and like that, whenever she's actually like sort of made up, and then obviously the shopping scene is sort
the
of
famous
a very
shopping
famous
scene.
bit, and which I think is the ultimate fairy tale moment for me in this is definitely the shopping scene, but also because of the framing of it, of her obviously being turned down by these like really snobby boutique owners on in Beverly Hills and
Rodeo Drive.
and Rodeo Drive, and then she has to come back, or she comes back because nobody will help. Like he's surprised that she only bought like the one dress for the dinner, and she's like, yeah, because they were mean to me, and he was like, they were mean to you, and like literally takes her hand,
and this is
it's like
which is one of those things which I appreciate as being the fantasy and wish fulfillment, and apparently this is something that the screenwriter experienced himself. Like he went shopping to one of those high class stores and tried to buy a shirt, and they basically just looked down on him. We don't have anything in your price range here, and basically just slunk out. And him, like Julia Roberts as his proxy, then actually getting to come back and delivering her big mistake, big, huge line is that's just kind of comeuppance for these people. This is just the thing. On the other hand, the reason she can do that, and this is something that I think we also need to talk about, because this is like at the end of the 80s, it clearly inspired by Wall Street and the whole like high finance world. The reason she can do that is not out of anything else but money, right? She has access to money now. That is the one thing that is different about her. And that struck me as very much in the vein of 1980s movies like Back to the Future, where the good life that he comes back to, that Marty comes back to, where his family's well off. Like that is really this kind of Reagan America idea of
although I
wealth.
mean the movie obviously spends so much time saying that money isn't everything, because Richard Gere is fundamentally like unhappy. Like he doesn't have anything in his life other than the money. But obviously, I mean, it is also sort of the sad truth of like, there are enough people in the world that if you had only given them access to like even to what to some of us is like a laughable amount of money, would radically change their lives, particularly in the United States. But I think that is also that moment where he's sort of like, when their week, like the week that they agree to spend together ends, and he's like, well, I want to see you again, but I could put you up in like a condo or whatever, and like you'd see you. And then she's like, well, it's just a change in geography, because she would still be a kept woman. Like she would still be his prostitute, and I want to use that term in that sense because I think it's important to use it in that context, because that's also what like sort of the more derogatory look of like, that doesn't change, because she made so much of a point of like, yes, I have to do sex work now because that earns me more money than like working in a McDonald's, but like I'm still trying to do this on my own terms, and I'm trying to do it without like a pimp and like being beholden to someone else, and like this wouldn't actually change anything, even though my life would be nicer and I might be safer, but my sort of agency would be taken away. And so and I mean, and the other thing that I mean comes with the money, but is also, I think, more importantly, the access also to sort of that culture, and like to it being able to envision a different life because of being exposed to culture is actually, I think, an important point that like is in there too in some ways.
Especially in the opera scene, because he like, this is a thing that I feel like this aged badly in the age of climate change, but he flies her from LA to San Francisco to go to the opera. Don't we have any opera worth going to in LA? And B, why do we have, this is the thing, I tried to figure out where this opera is in San Francisco. It's not an opera in San Francisco. It's like the Natural History Museum in LA inside, and outside it's like some institute building in Pittsburgh that they for some reason
For a
filmed for
moment,
that.
I was like, are they flying to New York to the Met? Which at least would make
which
more
was
sense.
referenced earlier, right? Yeah. But I think, which may have been the origin of that part of the story. But then they decided probably like, that's not an evening there and back, even if you have a private plane. I don't know, but the fact that she experiences the opera and she basically like cries at the end. She at first can't work the opera glasses, like they're broken when she just doesn't know how to flip them the right way, and just then completely loses herself in the opera. And the opera is so, I mean, I love this, but it's also so incredibly on the nose because it's La Traviata, the fallen woman. It's just so, which you obviously has to be kind of on the nose because I only realized this so much later. Because when I was a teenager, I was like, oh yeah, they're listening to opera and apparently it's important. No idea about any of this until I studied drama and I'm like, oh, now it makes sense.
Yeah. No,
but
I think that's
culture matters. Yeah.
And I think, and then obviously like the plot turning point and certain, like not turning, like one of the important points is like, how does he handle himself with her, like with other people? And it's sort of that moment where he ends up basically having to tell his lawyer that she's a sex worker because she could sort of came out of nowhere and he suspects her to like sort of leak info or like sort of be a mole.
He thinks she's a spy, basically.
Yeah. And so he's like, you don't have to worry about it because, she's a sex worker and this is what's happening. But obviously she's very hurt by the fact that this came up because then sleazy Jason Alexander comes up to her.
He's so good in this. I hate him so much in this.
And he comes up to her and is like sort of implying she could also sleep with him. But then obviously it is sort of that is being doubled down on by the end when she's already ready to leave and he's furious because Richard Gere like let the deal blew up that deal with that sort of hostile takeover of that company or whatever that was happening, and then it happens upon her in the suite and then basically she tries to rape her.
Very graphically, like to a degree that I honestly wouldn't expect in a movie today. That feels like there is something clearly to be said for rape not being taken seriously for a very long time. But I think that's also why something as graphic as this snuck into a romantic comedy movie. And it is very powerful because of that. So that's actually a quite interesting constellation.
And it is sort of the hints of this darker script. The other hint of the darker script is that there's a sex worker who was murdered, like right at the beginning of the movie.
Where Hank Azaria is like the detective. It is so funny.
Like, okay, you're there.
Why is he there? Yeah.
I don't know. And then, and then there's these tourists from Orlando who take pictures of the body. But like, that's also very LA, to be fair. I shouldn't be laughing about this every time it happens, but I do. But it is...
to be clear, not about the fact that somebody just got murdered.
No, but like, it's so LA. But it is... I wonder if I have a Mandela effect about this or if I was just more impressed by this when I was like 12. But I vividly remember watching this, and may have been the first time I was watching Pretty Woman on German TV by myself when I was like 12 or 13 something. And I feel like there was a cut of this movie where you see the body more clearly or something, or like is a more darker moment that I've not actually seen. But I watched this now in streaming and not on my disc. Maybe it is on my disc.
So there clearly is a longer cut. There's a director's cut which adds a couple of scenes, but they're not in the streaming Disney version that I saw. I also haven't pulled out my disc for this.
So maybe this.
I also wonder
TV aired
possibly. I also wonder if Disney, because some movies when they put them on streaming, they change them just a little bit to make basically the rating lower. And this might be one of those cases. Although I actually thought that was the case, and then And I thought it was because of the scene where Laura San Giacomo says Cinder fucking Rella. I'm like, oh, maybe they took that out. That was too much profanity. And then I had just misremembered where the scene goes because it comes relatively late in the movie, and I had just like mentally thought.
But there is a cut where the fuck is cut, obviously, because the US is so weird about swearing.
Like the plain version doesn't have that.
There's a plain version without that, but yeah, I mean, it is the one well-placed fuck that doesn't get you the R rating, which I love looking for now, because it's always like you're usually trying to make it count, and this one's definitely like, this is so much better if she says it that way.
Which is also like, it is kind of like this scene, like I've seen this scene so many times now. It's a weird scene because it's the scene where they actually talk about the fellow sex worker who got murdered, and Julia Roberts, Vivian, references her and says like, oh, like, when does this ever work out? When does fairy tale ever work out? And basically says, did it work out for her? No, it didn't work out for her. And then Laura San Giacomo's character Kit is basically pressed to find an example of when this ever worked out for anyone, and comes up with Cinderella, which is Cinder fucking Rella, which is I mean, is not a real person. So like the fairy tale worked out for the fairy tale character, which is kind of very meta in this sense.
And I think the sort of the undercurrent we don't quite see, and especially in that moment in LA in 1990 and like Sunset Boulevard, like drug abuse is like substance abuse. Like the fact where she's like, well, you know, it didn't work out for her because it was a very specific case of crack addicts. And it's like, yeah, and I mean, that is the whole thing. And that thing where briefly, like Richard Gere's character thinks she's taking drugs in his bathroom and wants to throw her out, and she's just flossing,
which is really which is really played for comedy, and it's pretty it's a good scene when she then says like, you shouldn't neglect your gums, which I feel is like a forever line. But the reason that's in there is because in the original draft she was a cocaine addict, and the reason that this person ends up paying her $3,000, which is more than she asked for or would have asked for. I think he initially offers her $2,000, is because she has to stay clean for the whole week. And so that's a leftover of this earlier grittier script, which is in there. And that's why it kind of also feels like it comes slightly out of nowhere, because the context isn't there. The context is you need to know how bad the drug problem was at the time.
Yeah, I think it matters to this context, but it also matters in like further establishing her as being the different one, like the one that is sort of still retains some of her naivete and is trying to hold on to some sort of innocence despite all of this, versus someone like Kit, who I don't think necessarily is a drug addict, but like definitely is much more established in like this whole culture of like, you know, she's been doing sex work for a long time. She parties, she drinks, she does all of this. She's not good with money. Like she probably also takes drugs. Like
she does definitely take drugs. Just what kinds of drugs is up?
Yeah, like she might not in the beginning.
Like, she might be taking weed,
or like heroin addict, or weed.
But there's that reference,
but like she probably also
no, but it does count in the context of like, that's when Julia Roberts doesn't have money for rent, is because Kit took it and bought drugs with it. And, but and we're made to believe it's not one of the bad drugs, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, coke is sort of one of the, is it bad? It depends if you're white or black, which is exactly the crack cocaine.
And it's the 80s drug, right?
Yeah, and it's 1990, so definitely this is about like crack cocaine.
Yeah, I mean, this is an 80s movie. Like it comes out in 90, but clearly all of it is an 80s movie.
It feels like in a weird way, it feels like already on that threshold of like, okay, I can see this is where we're like starting to get into, like there's something is shifting here.
But it's very much from the styles and from the things that are talked about and how they're talked about. It feels it has much more in common with 80s movies than it has with 90s movies.
For sure. With what is in that context, actually, the stark absence is HIV/AIDS. Like, I never thought about this.
Yeah, but she does present him with a choice of condoms, which is also kind of a weird thing to include in a movie. And it feels a little bit like we talked in Red, White, and Royal Blue, where they have the talk, and the talk is for the benefit of the viewers, not really for the benefit of the characters. And it did feel a little bit like that here. It's very in the background.
Obviously, like a sex worker would always try to use condoms, but like it still feels like there is more happening here to people also who are intravenous drug users at the time, and people who have sex with various partners that is sort of like screened out completely. But yeah,
but at least it's a little bit motivated by that condom scene.
Yeah,
so,
I do think so.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing also is what I do appreciate about the movie is also like, yeah, of course they have sex because this is literally in the movie, but I also really like how they shot those sex scenes because they do actually like that they're like sensual sex scenes and they do exist, and for a while they don't exist in movies. Like they're striking sort of a balance. Also because Richard Gere before that was in movies where there was a lot of nudity and a lot of explicit sex. And this feels like this sort of
he played the prostitute in one of his earlier movies. That's really for him. This was a change because he played the Julia Roberts character in earlier movies, which is actually also I think why the dynamic is so interesting and why it kind of works, because he has switched sides here and somehow has like knowledge of this, and it feels like it comes through in his performance, which is we're going to do in another episode. We're going to do what happens later. I was very much reminded with the David Duchovny performance in that movie as kind of referencing back to Richard Gere, the way that he talks and the way he presents himself, which obviously makes sense because this is, along with When Harry Met Sally, this comes out the year after. It is what kicks off this new cycle of romantic comedies, like the romantic comedies of the 1990s. Owe everything to When Harry Met Sally and Pretty Woman. And if those two movies hadn't existed and hadn't been successes, that whole cycle of Sandra Bullock, Julia Roberts, and Meg Ryan comedies would not have happened.
Yeah, for sure. Also, Roger Ebert also says it's like it is astonishing that Pretty Woman is such an innocent movie. It is the sweetest and most open-hearted love fable since The Princess Bride. Which also Rob Reiner, by the way, like once again, like
killing it.
The fuck Rob Reiner's run between like 80, like 5 or something, and 9, like it's insane.
He just kind of should have called it quits. Him like, nope, I did all the things I need to do. It feels like like you go to the Olympics 4 times and then you're done.
Between Carl Reiner and Rob Reiner,
yeah, the like, Reiners are
the fuck. But yeah, no. Yeah, sorry, this movie just works, and I'm not interested in 24-year-olds' opinions.
Oh, Sabrina is showing her millennial status.
I'm sorry.
People are fighting on social media so much about generations. You're wading into the war.
Yeah, but the problem is like sort of media journalism really pushes this, and like Tumblr discussions really push this.
And like clickbait pushes this.
Clickbait articles of like a 24, and I watched this, and my takeaway was it's problematic. I'm like, okay.
Which is true of literally, I think, every movie that we've ever done here are likely to do here.
Actually is significantly less problematic, although
that is interesting, yeah.
Although the most problematic thing about it is unfortunately its tagline.
Oh, what is the tagline?
There's 2, and the other one is just blah and it's sort of plot descriptive, but there is unfortunately literally a tagline that was, who knew it was so much fun to be a hooker?
What?
And I'm like,
who approved that?
Michael Eisner? I don't know.
Personally?
Probably not. But like, also I forgot to say this when you said Disney of all places, it makes sense because this is when Michael Eisner has taken over like a few years before, and then Jeffrey Katzenberg. And like it was Jeffrey Katzenberg's baby, and sort of under Michael Eisner to diversify Disney's lineup into more adult like out of entertainment. So something like Pretty Woman is exactly at the sweet spot of like Disney wanting to do sort of the like not losing their brand as like we also do fairy tales, but also producing a like this is the quintessential Eisner era Disney film. So it makes complete sense for the time.
Yeah. We also probably should be talking. I mean, we can get back to taglines. We're going to have to do that anyway with our fake taglines. But the question of genre, since this is also one of our things that we have in our lineup, which we always very much pay attention to and never just go on wild tangents for the whole episode. The question of genre, which is super interesting here because it obviously did not start out as a romantic comedy, and throughout the production process, from all the things that I've read, people weren't quite sure how this was going to land because it really depends on the chemistry. It depends on how the writing works and how all of these scenes cut together. And so apparently what Gary Marshall did, he shot at least 3 versions of every scene, one that leaned into the comedy, one that leaned into the drama, and one where he just basically told the actors to do whatever they felt was right. And I have never found, first of all, like how true this is and for how many scenes this held. And what I've also never found out is how much of what ended up in this movie, right? Which kinds of takes they used, because sometimes it might be necessary for the dramatic take to be used, even though in the end this is a comedy. So it's really interesting to me that they did not know until essentially the first test screenings, after it all had been cut together, like, oh yeah, we've made a romantic comedy, and not just any romantic comedy. We've made a genre-defining romantic comedy.
Yeah. I mean, it's a question of if they knew this. Like, I mean, sometimes it's like, I'm sure people who saw the final cut was like, this is great. But like, it's with all things, you know, like at that point, Julia Roberts isn't yet Julia Roberts. So that's also that factor. But obviously people were looking at this and it's like, okay, she's going to be Julia Roberts.
I mean, this is, which is the thing that I really noticed when I watched this last night, because Julia Roberts is just kind of, we accept that she's a huge movie star and that she got her break in Pretty Woman, and we just kind of accept that now. Every minute of her being on screen explains to you why she is a huge movie star. She is so likable. She has such presence. Her delivery and her choices, it's not so much in what she says. Every reaction is just so compelling. You understand. We were watching this, and Carrie at some point turns to me when she walks in the scene where she walks back from the shop that rejected her, and like, oh, you can see how she feels and how she walks. And this is what she does. She's so radiant. And honestly, that scene where she watches I Love Lucy in the hotel room, when she starts just laughing, like a whole world opens up. I absolutely, that is star power. Like, however you want to define it, it's crazy.
It is so hard to find someone, maybe Meg Ryan, but not even, like, I think Julia Roberts manages in movies to, like, especially if they sort of strip down her makeup and sort of, you still sometimes manage to buy her as like a normal person who's clearly, like, yes, a very charming normal person, but then if you dress her up, you do get sort of like, wow. And there's so much of those movies bank on that. But like, also the one we do have to do, because I've seen it a million times, I've actually seen it more often for Pretty Woman than for some reason, is Runaway Bride. Like,
oh yeah,
we put that
came up on streaming as the next one to watch when I finished this.
And I mean, I ironically love that one also because it has so many references back to Pretty Woman, and, like, you know,
it's not as good a movie, but it's still a romantic comedy.
So fun. But like in that one too, she strikes that balance of, like, I do buy that she lives in some small town and has sort of a hardware store, and it's, you know, and could be someone else. And it's just
I think it really, to me, comes back to her role in Mystic Pizza, where that is what she does. She lives in a small town and she's kind of a wild child, and she seems to be a cut above the rest, above all the other people in this town, but she still is of that town. And that, I think, is what makes people buy into it. She is one of the few people who you can dress down and people aren't going to be immediately, oh yeah, but she's way too pretty for this. Like, she is, but she also is believable. And I think it's probably just because she's not your run-of-the-mill, if that makes any sense, beauty. Like, this beauty standards, obviously most still apply, but she's not like the bombshell blonde, and I think that's part of the appeal. That's part of the reason why it works.
Yeah. And I mean, so her parents are actually, like, just looking this up, but like actors and playwrights. So she's sort of, it comes from that, but she's still born in like small town Georgia. And I think that is there. Like, that charm is actually, there is that certain genuine thing to it because it is like she's from Smyrna, Georgia. And I mean, I think what, like, having grown up watching most of these movies in German dub, like only later realizing, yes, she has a certain southern drawl, like not like massively pronounced, but like she can bring it where she needs to bring it. Obviously, Steve Magnolias then made use of that, but like even here, obviously, it is such a part of like, okay, I do believe her to be from a small town because she's not putting it on. That is her actual accent. She can turn it down now, and she's learned to code switch, and but like that is her actual accent, and I think that makes a difference than if someone from New York were to put that on for a performance. Like that, like Smyrna, Georgia, is a suburb of Atlanta. And there's also that thing of like where she attended same school as the children of Coretta and Martin Luther King Jr. and like her family is like her parents, I think, like were actually like donated money like a lot to like it's like supported the civil rights movement directly, which is sort of a fun dimension.
I mean, American history is everywhere, and we would like you all to pay more attention to it.
Yeah. And I think it was also like what I also keep forgetting is that just like her brother is also like her brother is Eric Roberts. Like, you know, he's not quite as successful as his sister, but like he's had a like decent run. And if you see him, like you've seen him in a bunch of things, and he's a good actor. But like sometimes they literally forget that they're related. And then obviously her niece, so his daughter, Emma Roberts, has sort of been in things, but yeah.
Also, obviously, in Gary Marshall movies, which kind of capitalize on that. Yeah.
But yeah.
It's it is to me a movie that I have seen many times, and you just leave a little bit of time between when you see it and then you see it again, and I always find something in it. It's one of those movies that has these different layers and little details that matter that you really completely miss the first, second, or third time are there, and they really make this cohesive. And it is probably one of those movies that really relies on the edit coming together. And it is one of those movies that if you had cast anyone else in, like all the suggestions of who was attached to this before, including Sean Connery or Al Pacino as Edward, would have just completely not worked at all.
Yeah, there's a story.
The chemistry is the other ingredient there.
There's a story. It's always like, is it actually how that happened? But like, apparently Richard Gere was like sort of they had a table read, like not a table read yet, but like probably a chemistry read or something. So like Richard Gere and Julia Roberts were definitely in the same room reading like scenes together already, and like with Gary Marshall and whomever would have been there. And I think Gere was sort of unsure if he wanted to do this, maybe because he had played like all these other parts. And allegedly Julia Roberts sort of wrote down, "Please take it," on like a post-it, like on a note, and pushed
please
it
do
over
this movie, yeah.
Please do this movie. And then he agreed because of her.
At least he said this, and I mean, there's different versions of what exactly she wrote on the post-it note, but I would assume the story is some version of the story is true. She convinced him to come aboard because it was apparently really hard to find the male lead for this movie because he is kind of a straight man. He just kind of he's very unlikable from what he does, and you kind of need to balance that out. The only thing that I think really didn't age well, I think there was this is in the MacLeod book, and I think it's Gary Marshall saying that they're trying to humanize him from being this corporate raider to more like of a Donald Trump style executive. I'm like, no. No. I mean, everything he does is still legal. Let's put it that way.
That is, yeah. But yeah. Oh yeah. So like two things before we wrap this up. But like the one thing I do also want to highlight is the soundtrack, because it is a fucking great soundtrack. Like not just obviously the Roxette song. That like also put Roxette. Like Roxette had a song in Pretty Woman and in Notting Hill, right? Yeah. No.
I don't know about Notting Hill, but
no,
they.
not in something. Come on, I know this. I should know this.
I don't know this. I do know that Roxette was reasonably successful in Europe before this, and what would become It Must Have Been Love was released as a Christmas single in, I think, specifically only Germany, and they were asked to contribute a song to the movie and didn't really have time to write a whole new song, so they just took out, I think, 1 or 2 references to Christmas out of the song and re-recorded it, and that's the song that's in the movie, and that's how they broke out in the States as well. The other thing about the soundtrack is, what I find really fascinating is, if you watch movies today, the soundtrack is very, like, songs kind of fade into each other, and they're used very deliberately and very sparingly. In this movie, songs just kind of like, you get like an abrupt fade, and then the next song starts. You get like a montage with a song, and then right after that, you get the next montage with a song. We don't do that anymore. That's super interesting.
Also, I think the Roy Orbison Pretty Woman is actually just in there just a bit in like the shopping. It isn't even that, like, it is there, but I feel like it is less sort of prominent as you kind of want to remember it is, because it's the song with the same title.
It's got
that's
that's
older than that, but like, I'm just trying to look up Roxette, like, because they had a big song on something else and another big romantic comedy.
I don't remember. The only other big Roxette song attached to a movie that I remember is the one from the Super Mario Brothers movie, which I don't know.
Unreal, which I just read was supposed to be in Hocus Pocus, which is also
that makes so much more sense.
Yeah,
but it's still a good song, but it's weirdly situated on that soundtrack of the Super Mario Brothers movie.
No, but like, obviously, It Must Have Been Love.
I have the single, by the way. That's one of the ones where I actually have the single.
I mean, song. And then also, actually underrated for me is the, like, almost right in the beginning when he starts to drive away from this party. That I'm completely forgetting what it's called now. That sort of sets a nice vibe.
Is it wishful thinking?
Wishful thinking.
Yeah.
I'm the king of wishful thinking, which was like a nice characterization for like both of them, I guess. But also it is a upbeat song that's actually super depressing.
This is the thing with so many songs. I love, and I have like, this is the thing. I love upbeat songs about, kind of like defiantly upbeat songs about sad things. Like, this is a thing that I've discovered I really like. I think there's a Sarah Bareilles song that really talks about, it's like this whole idea of like relationship ending, getting over someone, but it's not like a sad mopey song. It's like, oh yeah, I'm not okay right now, but I'm going to be fine. Like, I'm the king of wishful thinking. And this is also playing after he essentially just got broken up with by his girlfriend in New York. And that's what also prompts him to take the car and then meet Vivian. So we get the immediate motivation for him to why he doesn't have anyone that he can bring to his like business dates, and why he needs to pick up Vivian. And it makes him relatable in a way that she's the one who accuses him of always wanting her to be at his beck and call, and then he references that later. He literally pays Julia Roberts for that. So it's nicely done again, how all of this connects. One of the things that I think is really interesting about a bunch of the reviews of this movie, which are not the Roger Ebert review, is that it is once again one of those things where it's a romantic comedy. It is generally more targeted at women, and all the male critics were not really having it. Like, a lot of them were kind of down on this movie. And interestingly enough, this movie, which is a fairy tale, and in the end he comes and is the knight in shining armor, actually has been kind of reassessed by scholars as being much more feminist than it was originally given credit for. And part of that is that it's not just him Pygmalioning Julia Roberts, it's also her basically when she goofs off
she
and like
rescues him
she
right
rescues him right back. Like that's the theme. Which is that's a powerful scene, right? You know, because then only when she does that do you realize that they're going to have a happy ending, because they are equals now, right? That's that's what this movie trends toward, and it's powerfully there. And there's one book that I found. I haven't read all of it. I've just read some parts of it, which is, I think, I'm looking this up now, because it's one of those. This is one of those movies where I just kind of like rabbit hole and then just like go into. It's Mary Ruti's Feminist Film Theory and Pretty Woman, which is 2016, so it's not super recent, but relatively recent, which makes a bunch of these arguments. And I think this is a movie that is worth of discussion. It is worth of people seeing it, and worth of people thinking a little bit more about it than just saying it's problematic. And like, yeah, it is, but like in the way that it's clearly a product of its time, and not in the way where everybody at the time already found it problematic and it shouldn't have been as big as it was.
It also, like, I mean, IMDb has a 7.1 rating, which we know is for romanticom is very high, but also almost expected it to be higher. But that's probably sort of like the constant discussion of like how feminist this is. Is this problematic? What is the depiction of sex workers, which again is in some ways realistic, and in others it's just very trope, because it is the, like, you know, quote unquote hooker with a heart of gold trope.
Completely.
But it is still the thing. And I mean the other tagline that is not as shit as the one I already
oh yeah, let's do taglines.
Is, by the way, she walked off the street into his life and stole his heart, which I think actually has that dynamic. It is kind of blah, but it's still sort of the dynamic of like she does something to him, and that is important. Yeah. Did I actually write down my fake one? I'm not sure.
I have my fake one.
I have a fake one for what we're recording later, but I don't know if I have one. What's your fake one?
My fake one is, wait, I just had it. I like, now that you're asking, like, wait, what was my fake? Like, I had it like laid out to speak it out, and now like I'm completely blanking it. Hold on. I had thought about one that was let's be kings of wishful thinking, but I had actually another fake one, which now I'm completely blanking on, because I didn't write it down, because I had it in my head and I was walking around today. I'm like, oh, this is such a good fake tagline, and it just left my mind. It'll be in the show notes if I remember it.
Okay. Yeah, I think I did write anything down smartly, because it was so thrown by the really, really, really bad actual tagline. Oh no!
I do have it now. It's "You love this movie more than life itself," which references, of course, the Walkman scene. So
yeah,
it's not the greatest. But obviously we're doing better than the original tagline. So
that is yeah. No, I think I'm just gonna reiterate how much I like what Roger Ebert's thing is, like, I love based on staying awake after the lights are out, because like you'd assume this is about sex, but it's not, right? And
it's again about people talking, which is the best
about
thing.
Intimacy that comes from like conversation and getting to know you and each other. Aside from that, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so okay. Question: is this a rom-com? I think there is no question. I think we both know it didn't start out as one.
It definitely
clearly is one.
Into romance. There aren't quite as like laugh out loud moments. There aren't like,
but there are funny moments.
But there are funny moments. There's some good lines. But yeah,
like I laughed again at Big Mistake, Huge. The Walkman scene is pretty funny.
That's cute, yeah.
There are actually funny lines, and the fact that there's drama interspersed, I don't think detracts from that. It is an upbeat movie, and it is a funny movie, and I would wholeheartedly recommend that if you haven't watched it recently, just watch it with all the knowledge you might have of what romantic comedies came before and after and how this fits in. And despite all the issues and all the questions about how sex work is portrayed and how it takes kind of a problematic, again, here we are, tack on what it means to be rich and what it means to be a person who basically destroys companies for a living and who is portrayed as a sympathetic character, and how we might not necessarily want those heroes in our media. It works. It's great. Richard Gere looks ridiculously young, which I only noticed now, and definitely didn't.
I actually wanted to look up how old Julia Roberts.
She was in her early 20s. I think 23, 24, which really works in this sense. I don't actually remember how old he was, but I always thought that he was like, very old because he has gray hair. But now knowing people who are younger than me who have gray hair, I'm like, oh, well,
yeah.
Okay,
I think he's one of those who's like almost always, there's like one still of a movie from the 80s I've seen where he's like, I think he just has that one.
Yeah, I think he just turned 35 and then had gray hair from then.
But he has like sort of white hair, so that works. But
yeah. Okay, so how do we like this movie? What is our rating for this movie? What do you think?
It rated 5 out of 5 slippery little fuckers, snails.
Oh, we didn't even talk about the scene. It was so good.
No, it is a classic.
It's a classic. Just go watch the movie. I've been debating between 4 and 5 because, but I think I'm going to land on 5 just because the way that this thing cuts together is so spectacular and unexpected.
It's honestly very hard to find fault with it. Like if you don't like the premise, if you think this is just like not feminist enough, or if it's like the depiction of sex workers is not realistic enough, then you're like watching the wrong movie. I think if you go in with that head, it's like mind space.
It's clearly a fairy tale movie, and it stands like you have to. I mean, you have to review it as if you were reviewing a version of Cinderella or Pygmalion, not anything that's actually approaching reality. And for that, I'm gonna give it 5 big mistakes. Big, huge.
All right.
Yeah, it's a great movie.
That's it.
That's it. Watch it.